The Roman Empire, in 270 AD, was a civilization on the brink of collapse. Barbarian tribes pressed against every frontier. Usurpers proclaimed themselves emperor in distant provinces. Economic collapse ravaged the currency. Plague had devastated the population. The once mighty empire seemed destined to fragment into successor kingdoms, its glory days forever behind it. Then came Aurelian, a soldier's emperor, born of humble origins, forged in decades of frontier warfare. In just 5 years, he would reconquer lost territories, defeat multiple usurpers, and restore the empire's unity through a combination of military genius and relentless determination. His greatest triumph came against an enemy that had dared to claim equality with Rome itself, the breakaway Palmyrene Empire ruled by the warrior queen Zenobia. In the deserts of Syria, Aurelian's cavalry would execute one of the most devastating tactical victories in Roman military history, annihilating approximately 50,000 Palmyrene troops and deciding the fate of the eastern Mediterranean. The crisis of the 3rd century. To understand the magnitude of Aurelian's achievement, we must first grasp the desperate state of the Roman Empire when he assumed power. The period known as the crisis of the 3rd century had begun in 235 AD with the assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander. In the following decades, the empire experienced unprecedented chaos. Between 235 and 285 AD, at least 50 men would claim the imperial throne, most dying violent deaths after brief reigns. This political instability had devastating practical consequences. The frontiers, which had remained relatively secure for 2 centuries, began to buckle under sustained barbarian pressure. The Germanic Alemanni invaded Italy itself in 260 AD, an almost unthinkable violation of the homeland's sanctity. The Goths ravaged the Balkans and Asia Minor. The Sassanid Persian Empire, Rome's great rival in the east, sensed weakness and launched aggressive campaigns into Roman Mesopotamia and Syria. Economic collapse compounded military disaster. Successive emperors, desperate to pay their troops and maintain loyalty, debased the silver coinage until it contained virtually no precious metal. Inflation spiraled out of control. The complex trade networks that had sustained Roman prosperity fractured as regions turned inward, seeking self-sufficiency rather than depending on an increasingly unreliable imperial system. In this chaos, powerful regional commanders began establishing semi-independent domains. In Gaul, the so-called Gallic Empire emerged in 260 AD under Postumus, controlling Britain, Gaul, and parts of Spain. This wasn't a hostile breakaway so much as a pragmatic response to Rome's inability to defend these provinces. Postumus and his successors claimed to be protecting Roman civilization in the West, while the central government struggled with more immediate threats. But the most significant breakaway state emerged in the East, centered on the wealthy caravan city of Palmyra. The rise of Palmyra. Palmyra occupied a unique position in the Roman world. Located in the Syrian desert, it had grown wealthy as a crucial node in the trade routes connecting the Roman Mediterranean with Persia, India, and ultimately China. Palmyrene merchants spoke Greek, Aramaic, and Arabic. They understood both Roman and Persian court culture. Their city was simultaneously a Roman provincial capital and a cosmopolitan crossroads, where East met West. When the Sassanid Persians captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 AD, one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history, the entire eastern frontier collapsed. Persian armies ravaged Syria and Anatolia unopposed. In this vacuum, Septimius Odaenathus, the Roman-appointed governor of Palmyra, took extraordinary action. He assembled an army, marched against the Persians, and achieved what Rome itself had failed to do. He defeated the Sassanids, and drove them back beyond the Euphrates. Rome, desperate and grateful, granted Odaenathus extraordinary powers. He became effectively the military commander of the entire Roman East, with authority approaching that of a co-emperor. He styled himself King of Kings, a Persian title, while simultaneously maintaining loyalty to Rome. Under his leadership, Palmyra prospered as never before, its merchant princes financing military expeditions that protected their trade routes while expanding Palmyrene influence. Then, in 267 AD, Odaenathus was assassinated, possibly by a relative, possibly by political enemies, possibly even at Roman instigation, though the truth remains uncertain. His widow, Zenobia, assumed power as regent for their young son, Vaballathus. She was an extraordinary woman by any measure, highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, including Egyptian, Greek, and Latin, politically astute, and possessed of genuine military talent. She claimed descent from Cleopatra and the Ptolemaic pharaohs, positioning herself as heir to both Hellenistic and Egyptian imperial traditions. Initially, Zenobia maintained the fiction of Roman loyalty, ruling in the name of her son but wielding actual power herself. But as the Central Empire continued to struggle through the 260s, Zenobia's ambitions grew bolder. Palmyrene armies invaded and conquered Egypt, seizing control of Rome's grain supply. They pushed into Asia Minor, occupying much of what is now Turkey. By 270 AD, Zenobia ruled an empire stretching from central Anatolia to the borders of Nubia, encompassing the wealthiest provinces of the Roman East. In 271 AD, Zenobia made her move explicit. She proclaimed her son not merely Caesar, junior emperor, but Augustus, equal in rank to the Roman emperor himself. Coins were minted showing Vaballathus and Zenobia with full imperial regalia. The message was clear. Palmyra was no longer a Roman client state, but an independent empire claiming sovereignty over the Roman East. This was the situation Aurelian inherited when he became emperor in September 270 AD. Aurelian, the soldier emperor, Lucius Domitius Aurelianus, was born around 214 AD to a family of modest means, possibly in the Danube provinces, possibly in Illyricum. Sources differ, and he may have encouraged the ambiguity to cultivate a mystique. What is certain is that he rose through the ranks through military merit in an era when competence in battle was the only reliable path to advancement. He served on multiple frontiers, fighting Goths, Persians, and Germanic tribes. His troops called him manu ad ferrum, hand on sword, reflecting his personal courage in combat. Aurelian's military philosophy emphasized mobility, aggressive action, and the decisive use of cavalry. He understood that the old legionary system, designed for methodical conquest and occupation of territory, was ill-suited to the empire's current crisis. The threats came from multiple directions simultaneously. Roman forces needed to move quickly between theaters, strike hard, and disengage before becoming pinned down in protracted campaigns. Cavalry became central to Aurelian's approach. The traditional Roman military had always emphasized infantry legions, with cavalry playing a supporting role. But the enemies Rome now faced, Gothic horsemen, Persian cataphracts, and the highly mobile Palmyrene forces, required a response in kind. Aurelian expanded and professionalized the cavalry arm, recruiting excellent horsemen from throughout the empire and especially from the Danubian provinces, known for their equestrian traditions. When Aurelian assumed power in 270 AD, he faced immediate crises on every front. Germanic invasions threatened Italy. The Goths ravaged the Balkans. The Gallic Empire controlled the West, and Zenobia's Palmyrene Empire dominated the East. Lesser emperors might have tried to hold what territory remained and negotiate with the breakaway states. Aurelian chose instead to reconquer everything, beginning with the most serious threat, Palmyra. The campaign begins. In early 272 AD, Aurelian marched east with approximately 40,000 to 50,000 troops, a substantial force by the standards of the crisis period, though hardly overwhelming. His army represented a cross-section of the empire's remaining military strength: legionary infantry from the Danube provinces, cavalry units from Mauritania and Pannonia, auxiliaries from throughout the empire, and personal bodyguard units of exceptional quality. The campaign's early stages proceeded methodically. Aurelian moved through Asia Minor, securing cities that had submitted to Palmyrene authority. Most chose not to resist. The Roman emperor arrived with a powerful army, and Zenobia's forces were stretched thin, trying to garrison an enormous territory. City after city opened its gates, and Aurelian showed calculated mercy, punishing only the most prominent collaborators while integrating the rest back into the empire. Zenobia, meanwhile, was assembling her forces. The Palmyrene military was formidable by any standard. Its core consisted of the famous Palmyrene archers, mounted bowmen who could shoot accurately from horseback, combining mobility with firepower. Heavy cavalry, including armored cataphracts influenced by Persian models, provided shock power. Arab tribal allies contributed light cavalry skirmishers who excelled in desert warfare. And substantial infantry forces, though generally considered less effective than the cavalry, rounded out the army. Intelligence reports reaching Aurelian suggested the Palmyrene army numbered between 70,000 and 100,000 troops, though such ancient figures are always suspect and likely inflated. Modern historians estimate the true figure was probably 50,000 to 70,000, still substantially larger than Aurelian's force. More concerning than the numbers was the quality. The Palmyrene cavalry had defeated Persians and had experience fighting in the exact terrain where the coming battles would occur. The two armies converged on the city of Antioch, the great metropolis of Roman Syria and third largest city in the empire after Rome and Alexandria. Zenobia had placed a garrison there, but as Aurelian approached with his main force, the city's population rebelled and drove out the Palmyrene troops. Aurelian entered Antioch in triumph, securing a major propaganda victory and a crucial logistical base. But the Palmyrene field army remained intact, and Zenobia herself was moving north from Palmyra with reinforcements. The decisive confrontation was approaching. The Battle of Imai, approximately 30 kilometers south of Antioch, near the town of Imai, the two armies finally met in battle. The exact date in 272 AD is uncertain, likely sometime in spring or early summer. The terrain was relatively open ground, not pure desert, but the semi-arid steppe typical of inland Syria, with scattered vegetation and rolling topography that allowed for large-scale cavalry maneuvers. Zenobia's commanders, primarily the general Zabdas, who had led many of her successful campaigns, deployed the Palmyrene army in a conventional formation for the era. The heavily armored cataphracts held the center, ready to deliver the decisive charge that would shatter the Roman line. The famous Palmyrene horse archers occupied the wings, positioned to harass the Roman flanks and exploit any breakthrough achieved by the heavy cavalry. Infantry forces provided depth and secured the camp. Aurelian, observing the Palmyrene deployment, recognized both the strengths and the critical weakness of his opponent's formation. The Palmyrene cavalry was superb, but their tactical doctrine emphasized the aggressive offensive. They sought to overwhelm enemies through rapid advances, devastating archery, and thunderous charges by the cataphracts. This approach had worked brilliantly against Persians and against less disciplined Roman forces in earlier engagements. But Aurelian had spent his entire career fighting mobile, cavalry forces. He understood their psychology, their tactics, and most importantly, their limitations. Horse archers and cataphracts were devastating in the charge and pursuit, but they had weaknesses. Horses could not maintain a gallop indefinitely. Cataphracts, despite their fearsome appearance, sacrificed mobility for protection. The armored horses and riders were slower and less maneuverable than lighter cavalry. And most crucially, cavalry formations could be drawn out of position by a clever opponent. Aurelian devised a tactical plan that would exploit these vulnerabilities. He positioned his own cavalry, significantly lighter and more mobile than the Palmyrene cataphracts, in a forward position. His instructions to his cavalry commanders were precise and unconventional. When the Palmyrene horse archers and cataphracts charged, the Roman cavalry was to retreat. Not in panicked flight, but in controlled withdrawal, maintaining formation while giving ground. This was an extraordinarily difficult maneuver to execute. Cavalry retreating before an enemy charge must maintain discipline and cohesion, or the retreat becomes a rout. The horses must be held at a speed that keeps them ahead of pursuers, but doesn't exhaust them. The riders must resist the natural instinct to either stand and fight, or to flee in panic. It required exceptional training, iron discipline, and absolute trust in their commander's plan. As the battle commenced, the Palmyrene cavalry advanced as expected. The horse archers moved forward first, loosing volleys of arrows at the Roman cavalry. The cataphracts followed, building momentum for their devastating charge. And then, as they closed with the Roman cavalry, Aurelian's horsemen wheeled and retreated. The Palmyrenes pursued, smelling victory. From their perspective, the Roman cavalry was fleeing in disarray. They pressed their advantage, horse archers continuing to shoot, cataphracts maintaining their charge. The pursuit continued for perhaps a kilometer, possibly more. Ancient sources are imprecise about distances, but modern battlefield archaeology suggests a substantial chase occurred. What the Palmyrenes failed to notice in their excitement was that they were being led into a trap. Aurelian had positioned his infantry, the still formidable Roman legionaries, in a concealed location, possibly behind a rise in the terrain or screened by the cavalry's initial position. As the Palmyrene cavalry, now disordered by the pursuit and with their horses winded from the extended chase, pushed forward, they suddenly found themselves facing fresh infantry formations. The Roman infantry held firm. Legionaries locked shields in the testudo formation, presenting an impenetrable barrier to cavalry. Javelins and pila flew into the confused Palmyrene ranks. And then Aurelian sprung the second part of his trap. His cavalry, which had been conducting a feigned retreat and whose horses were relatively fresh, turned and charged back into the flanks of the disordered Palmyrene formations. The Palmyrene cavalry, caught between infantry to their front and cavalry on their flanks, with exhausted horses and formations broken by the pursuit, collapsed. The horse archers, whose effectiveness depended on mobility and distance, found themselves in a close-quarters melee where their bows were useless. The cataphracts, whose armored charges were devastating in open terrain, were trapped and unable to maneuver effectively. The battle turned into a massacre. Roman cavalry, with their tactical advantage restored and with fresh mounts, cut down Palmyrene horsemen who could neither flee effectively nor turn to fight. The Roman infantry advanced methodically, killing or capturing those Palmyrenes who had been unhorsed or who attempted to surrender. Ancient sources claim that approximately 50,000 Palmyrene troops died at Ime. Though this figure is almost certainly exaggerated, it likely represents the claimed total strength of Zenobia's army rather than the actual casualties. Modern historians estimate the true Palmyrene losses at perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 killed or captured, which was still catastrophic. The core of Zenobia's mobile field army had been annihilated in a single afternoon. The feigned retreat, Ancient tactic, perfect execution. The tactical maneuver Aurelian employed, the feigned retreat followed by a counterattack against a pursuing enemy, was not new. It had ancient precedents stretching back to the Scythians, and most famously the Parthians, who had destroyed Marcus Crassus's army at Carrhae in 53 BC using similar tactics. What made Aurelian's version remarkable was the perfect execution and the reversal of the expected roles. Typically, the feigned retreat was employed by horse archer cultures against heavy infantry. The mounted archers would harass infantry formations, retreat when charged, draw the infantry out of formation, and then turn to annihilate the disordered troops. Aurelian had essentially reversed the tactic, using it against a cavalry army that expected to be the ones employing such maneuvers. The psychological dimension was crucial. The Palmyrene commanders and troops believed they understood this style of warfare. It was their home ground, their preferred tactical approach. When they saw Roman cavalry retreating, their cultural and tactical assumptions led them to pursue aggressively. They were, in essence, victims of their own expectations and overconfidence. The execution required extraordinary discipline from the Roman cavalry. These troops had to retreat convincingly enough to draw the Palmyrenes into the trap, but maintain sufficient cohesion to turn and counterattack when ordered. Ancient sources, while not detailed on this point, suggest that Aurelian had specifically selected and trained his cavalry for exactly this type of operation. The months of campaigning through Asia Minor had likely included extensive drilling on coordinated maneuvers. The coordination between cavalry and infantry was equally impressive. The timing had to be precise. If the infantry revealed themselves too soon, the Palmyrenes could have disengaged and escaped the trap. If the infantry waited too long, the Roman cavalry might have been genuinely routed. Aurelian's personal command and control of the battle, his ability to sense the exact moment when the Palmyrene pursuit had become irrevocably committed, made the difference between success and disaster. Aftermath and pursuit. The destruction of the Palmyrene field army at Imme had immediate strategic consequences. Zenobia, who had been with the army or nearby, fled south toward Palmyra with her surviving troops, likely a few thousand cavalry who had not been caught in the trap, plus her personal guard. The cities of Syria, which had been waiting to see the battle's outcome, now opened their gates to Aurelian. But the emperor understood that the victory, however complete, was not yet decisive. As long as Zenobia remained free and Palmyra itself remained intact, resistance could continue. The desert city was immensely wealthy, its treasury filled with the profits of decades of trade and recent conquests. With those resources, Zenobia could hire new armies, rally supporters, and potentially continue the war for years. Aurelian could not allow her that opportunity. He immediately organized a pursuit, using his still intact cavalry to harry the Palmyrene remnants and prevent them from regrouping. The chase continued south through Syria, past Emesa, modern Homs, toward Palmyra itself. Near Emesa, approximately 100 kilometers north of Palmyra, Zenobia made one final attempt to stop the Roman advance. She had gathered what forces she could: survivors from Imme, garrison troops pulled from cities, new levies hastily raised from among Palmyrene citizens and allied Arab tribes. Ancient sources again claim implausibly large numbers, but the reality was likely a force of 15,000 to 25,000 troops, substantially smaller and less capable than the army destroyed at Imme. The Battle of Emesa followed a similar pattern to Imme, though the details are less well documented. Aurelian again used his cavalry to devastating effect, and again the Palmyrene forces were routed with heavy losses. Zenobia's last field army had been destroyed. The road to Palmyra lay open. The Siege of Palmyra. Zenobia retreated to Palmyra itself and prepared for a siege. The city was not particularly defensible by Roman standards. It had walls, but they were designed more to control trade and discourage raiders than to withstand a determined assault by a professional Roman army. However, Palmyra's real defense was its location. Situated deep in the Syrian desert, it could only be supplied by long, vulnerable caravan routes. An army besieging Palmyra would itself face significant logistical challenges. Zenobia's strategy was to hold out long enough for Aurelian's army to exhaust its supplies, or for new threats to emerge elsewhere that would force the emperor to abandon the siege. She sent envoys to the Sassanid Persians requesting assistance, hoping that Rome's traditional enemy would see an opportunity to strike while Aurelian was preoccupied. She also attempted to negotiate with Aurelian, offering surrender terms that would preserve some level of Palmyrene autonomy. Aurelian rejected any compromise. He had not marched across Asia Minor and destroyed 2 Palmyrene armies, only to accept a settlement that would leave Zenobia in power. His terms were unconditional. Zenobia must surrender personally, and Palmyra must submit completely to Roman authority. He also worked to secure his supply lines, establishing supply depots and making arrangements with local Arab tribes to provide provisions and intelligence. The siege lasted several months through the summer of 272 AD. Aurelian's troops surrounded the city and began constructing siege works, though a full-scale assault never proved necessary. Inside Palmyra, food supplies dwindled. The wealthy merchant elite, who had supported Zenobia as long as her rebellion was successful, began questioning the wisdom of continued resistance. The Persian assistance Zenobia had hoped for never materialized. The Sassanids were dealing with their own internal problems and saw no advantage in provoking a direct confrontation with a resurgent Rome. Finally realizing her position was hopeless, Zenobia attempted to escape. Under cover of darkness, she and a small group of loyal followers slipped out of the city on camels, planning to cross the desert to Persian territory. But Aurelian's intelligence network, which included Arab scouts intimately familiar with desert travel, detected the escape attempt. Roman cavalry pursued and captured Zenobia as she attempted to cross the Euphrates River. With their queen captured, Palmyra surrendered. Aurelian's terms were initially relatively lenient. The common citizens were spared, and the city was not sacked. The emperor recognized Palmyra's economic importance and hoped to reintegrate it peacefully into the empire. He placed a Roman garrison in the city and then marched west, taking Zenobia with him as a prisoner destined for Rome. Rebellion and retribution. But the story did not end there. Within months of Aurelian's departure, Palmyra rebelled again. A faction of the merchant elite, possibly encouraged by lingering Palmyrene loyalists and perhaps hoping to restore some measure of independence, massacred the Roman garrison and proclaimed independence once more. They may have believed that Aurelian was too far away to respond quickly, or that the emperor would accept a negotiated settlement rather than undertake another desert campaign. They were catastrophically wrong. Aurelian, who was still in Asia Minor when he received news of the rebellion, immediately turned his army around and marched back to Palmyra. This time, there would be no mercy. The emperor was determined to make an example that would discourage any other cities from testing Roman resolve. The second siege of Palmyra, in 273 AD, was brief. The city, without Zenobia's leadership and without the military forces that had been destroyed at Imai and Emesa, could offer only token resistance. Aurelian's troops stormed the walls, and the emperor ordered the city sacked. The great temples were looted, the merchant palaces destroyed, much of the population killed or enslaved. Palmyra, which had been one of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan cities in the Roman East, was reduced to a provincial backwater, never to regain its former glory. The destruction of Palmyra sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world. Aurelian had demonstrated that rebellion, even by powerful and wealthy provinces, would be met with overwhelming force and complete destruction. Other potential separatist movements took note. Zenobia's fate. The fate of Zenobia herself remains one of history's intriguing mysteries. Ancient sources provide conflicting accounts. The most commonly cited version claims that Aurelian brought her to Rome in 274 AD to march in his triumph, the traditional Roman celebration of military victory, where defeated enemies were paraded through the streets before the populace. According to this account, Zenobia was displayed in golden chains so heavy that she required assistance to walk, though she bore this humiliation with dignity. The Roman crowd, accustomed to despising defeated enemies, was said to have been impressed by her composure and intelligence. After the triumph, rather than executing her as was traditional for conquered rulers, Aurelian granted her a villa in Tibur, modern Tivoli, and a pension. She supposedly lived out the rest of her life in comfortable retirement, her daughters marrying into Roman senatorial families. Other sources claim she died before reaching Rome, either through suicide, illness during the journey, or execution along the way. Still others suggest she died en route to the triumph, possibly refusing food in a final act of defiance. The truth is unknowable with certainty, though the villa at Tibur story persisted strongly enough in ancient sources to suggest at least some factual basis. What is certain is that Zenobia had carved out a remarkable position for herself in history. She had ruled an empire stretching from Egypt to Anatolia, defeated Persian armies, and challenged Rome itself. For a time, she had made Palmyra a power equal to Rome in the east. Her final defeat did not diminish these achievements, but rather highlighted the extraordinary military genius required to overcome her forces. Aurelian's genius and legacy. The campaign against Palmyra, and particularly the battles of Imae and Emesa, showcased Aurelian's military brilliance. He had defeated numerically superior forces fighting on their home terrain by combining tactical innovation with superb execution. The feigned retreat at Imae demonstrated sophisticated understanding of cavalry warfare and the psychology of his opponents. The relentless pursuit that prevented Zenobia from regrouping showed strategic vision that looked beyond immediate battlefield victory to long-term resolution. Aurelian's use of cavalry as the decisive arm reflected his understanding that Roman military doctrine needed to evolve. The heavy infantry legions that had conquered the Mediterranean world were still valuable, but the empire's current challenges required mobility, speed, and the ability to meet cavalry opponents on their own terms. Aurelian's integration of cavalry and infantry, using each arm to complement the other's strengths, pointed toward the military organization that would eventually characterize the later Roman Empire. The emperor's treatment of conquered territories also showed political acumen. His initial leniency toward Palmyra reflected an understanding that harsh treatment would create permanent enmity and require indefinite military occupation. Only when Palmyra rebelled a second time did he resort to destruction, and even then it served a calculated purpose: to demonstrate that Rome's patience had limits and rebellion would ultimately be crushed. After defeating Palmyra, Aurelian turned his attention to the Gallic Empire. In 274 AD, he defeated the Gallic emperor Tetricus at the Battle of Chalons, reunifying the western provinces with the Central Empire. In just 4 years, Aurelian had restored territorial integrity to the Roman Empire, defeating breakaway states and barbarian invaders through a combination of military victories and diplomatic skill. Aurelian's other achievements included economic reforms, the construction of the massive Aurelian walls around Rome, acknowledging that even the capital needed physical defenses in this dangerous era, and the establishment of the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, as a unifying imperial religion. He earned the title Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World, a recognition that he had quite literally saved the Roman Empire from disintegration. Tragically, Aurelian's reign ended in 275 AD, when he was assassinated by his own officers due to a misunderstanding. A staff member forged documents suggesting that certain officers were marked for execution, prompting them to kill the emperor in preemptive self-defense. The truth emerged afterward, but by then Aurelian was dead, having ruled for only 5 years. The broader context: cavalry in ancient warfare. The Palmyrene campaigns exemplified the evolution of cavalry warfare in the ancient world. For centuries, infantry had dominated Mediterranean battlefields. The Greek phalanx, the Roman legion, these massed infantry formations were the primary instruments of military power. Cavalry served important but secondary roles: reconnaissance, pursuit of broken enemies, flank protection. But the 3rd century AD saw cavalry's importance increase dramatically. The Parthians, and later the Sassanid Persians, had always emphasized cavalry, with their heavy cataphracts and skilled horse archers. The various steppe peoples who pressed against Rome's northern frontiers were predominantly cavalry forces. As Rome faced these threats simultaneously across multiple frontiers, the empire's military organization had to adapt. Aurelian's campaigns demonstrated this adaptation in action. His cavalry were not merely supporting troops, but the decisive element in his battles. The feigned retreat at Emei could only work with highly disciplined, well-trained cavalry capable of executing complex maneuvers under pressure. The pursuit of Zenobia required mounted forces that could operate independently over long distances in difficult terrain. This transition toward cavalry-dominant warfare would continue in the centuries following Aurelian's death. The later Roman Empire and its Byzantine successor would develop increasingly sophisticated cavalry forces, culminating in the famous cataphract units that would dominate Eastern Mediterranean warfare for centuries. The seeds of this evolution were visible in Aurelian's Syrian campaigns. The Palmyrene legacy Palmyra itself never recovered from its destruction in 273 AD. The city continued to exist, but as a minor provincial town rather than the great cosmopolitan center it had been. The caravan trade routes shifted or declined as the political situation in the region remained unstable. By the time relative peace returned to the east in the 4th century, other cities had risen to prominence, and Palmyra had been forgotten by all but local inhabitants. The magnificent ruins that visitors see today, the great colonnaded street, the Temple of Bel, the tower tombs, date primarily to Palmyra's glory days in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. They stand as monuments to a civilization that briefly challenged Rome itself and nearly succeeded in establishing an independent Eastern empire. The destruction wrought by ISIS militants in 2015, when they demolished several key monuments, was a tragic echo of Aurelian's deliberate destruction 17 centuries earlier. Zenobia herself became a figure of legend and romance in later centuries. Medieval European writers portrayed her as a noble warrior queen, unjustly defeated by Roman imperialism. Arab historians celebrated her as an early champion of Eastern independence from Western domination. Renaissance and Enlightenment scholars debated her true character and motivations. She appeared in plays, operas, and eventually novels and films, a testament to the enduring fascination with her dramatic rise and fall. Modern historians have worked to separate the legendary Zenobia from the historical figure. She emerges as a highly capable ruler who seized an opportunity created by Roman weakness, built a regional empire through a combination of military force and political acumen, and maintained her power for the better part of a decade. Her ultimate defeat came not from any personal failing, but from the extraordinary bad fortune of facing one of Rome's most capable emperors at a time when she had overextended herself. Lessons in strategy and tactics. The campaign against Palmyra offers numerous lessons that remain relevant to military thinking. Aurelian's strategy demonstrated the importance of maintaining initiative and refusing to allow a defeated enemy time to recover. After destroying the Palmyrene army at Imae, he immediately pursued, rather than consolidating his position. This prevented Zenobia from rebuilding her forces and forced her into increasingly desperate measures. Tactically, the battles showcased the effectiveness of combining deception with superior execution. The feigned retreat was not merely a trick, but a carefully planned operation that required precise coordination between different units. It worked because Aurelian had trained his forces specifically for this type of operation and because he understood his enemy well enough to predict their response. The campaign also illustrated the limits of technological and numerical superiority. The Palmyrene forces likely outnumbered the Romans initially and fought on terrain they knew intimately. Their military technology, particularly their horse archers and cataphracts, was equal or superior to Roman equivalents. Yet they lost decisively because Aurelian's tactical genius and his troops' discipline overcame these material advantages. Finally, Aurelian's handling of victory and defeat contained political lessons. His initial leniency toward Palmyra reflected an understanding that magnanimity can be strategically valuable. His later harshness when the city rebelled a second time showed that flexibility must have limits. The complete destruction of Palmyra served as an unmistakable message. Rome could forgive defiance once, but persistent rebellion would be annihilated. Conclusion. The tide turns. The annihilation of the Palmyrene forces in 272–273 AD marked a turning point not just in Aurelian's reign, but in the broader crisis of the 3rd century. For decades, the Roman Empire had seemed to be in terminal decline, fracturing into regional kingdoms and losing territory to barbarian invasions. Aurelian's victories demonstrated that the empire could still produce leaders capable of reversing this collapse. The approximately 50,000 Palmyrene casualties, if we accept the ancient sources' claims, though the true figure was likely lower, represented the complete destruction of one of the most capable armies in the eastern Mediterranean. The Palmyrene military system, which had defeated Persians and established control over Egypt and Syria, proved unable to cope with Aurelian's combination of tactical innovation and relentless strategic pressure. The cavalry-focused battles at Imae and Emesa showcased a new approach to Roman warfare, one that emphasized mobility and decisive maneuver over the grinding attrition of traditional infantry combat. Aurelian had recognized that the empire's enemies had changed and that Roman military doctrine needed to evolve accordingly. His victories validated this approach and influenced Roman military organization for generations. Beyond the immediate military outcomes, the Palmyrene campaign had profound political consequences. It demonstrated that the Roman Empire remained capable of projecting power across vast distances, of defeating sophisticated enemies, and of enforcing its will on rebellious provinces. This restoration of prestige and credibility was perhaps as important as the physical reunification of lost territories. Zenobia's brief empire, for all its wealth and sophistication, could not ultimately withstand a revitalized Rome, led by a military genius. The dream of an independent Eastern empire died in the Syrian deserts, destroyed by Roman cavalry executing one of the most devastating tactical operations in ancient military history. The Roman Empire would survive for 2 more centuries in the West and more than a millennium in the East, its unity restored by a soldier emperor who understood that sometimes salvation comes from the aggressive use of cavalry at the decisive moment. Aurelian's legacy extended far beyond his brief reign. He had shown that the empire could be saved through military excellence, political will, and the courage to adapt traditional methods to new challenges. The cavalry that annihilated the Palmyrene forces represented not just tactical innovation, but a fundamental reimagining of Roman military power for a changed world. In that hot Syrian afternoon near Imei, when Roman horsemen turned from feigned retreat to devastating counterattack, the course of history shifted. An empire that had seemed doomed found new life, and a civilization that had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries proved it could still produce commanders worthy of its greatest traditions.